welcome to the Sociology of Sexualities optional supplementary podcast for Sociology 3U03. I'm Dr. Tina Fetner. Hey, guess what? You've made it to the end. This is the very last module of the Sociology of Sexualities course. And today I want to ask you, what's the big idea? That is to say, what should we reflect on in terms of the big ideas that are central to this course, right? And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some big ideas: social construction, social institution, and inequalities related to the sociology of sexualities, because if you finish this course, you really should. These are the big takeaways. I'll be very disappointed if you get out of this course and you don't have something to say about these three topics. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about the social construction of sexualities. This is our number one big idea of the sociology of sexuality. Guess what? Sexuality is socially constructed. And by now, you should have a very clear working understanding of what that means. Especially, you should not think that means that it's imaginary or somehow not real, right? In fact, what we mean by socially constructed is that sexuality is the product of historical forces that shape the meanings of our lives and the way that we communicate who we are sexually to other people. It is entangled with the social organization of, for example, gender, right? And how, for example, patriarchal a culture is, how much gender equality is there, is going to make a big difference to understanding how we understand sexuality in a given culture. It's also entangled with the social organization of family, right? Do we live in a patriarchal or matriarchal society? Do we live in a society where extended kin are considered part of the family, or a nuclear family model? Is it important for us culturally to keep our sexual relationships to just be limited to within the bounds of marriage over a lifetime, for example? I think these are the easiest ones to understand, but sociologists will have you stretch these concepts out and think about the way, in fact, the workplace is also entangled with the social construction of sexuality. How social classes, right, are important to understanding the social construction of sexuality. How race, and especially when we get to the inequality part, we'll talk about racial domination and racial oppression, is part and parcel with the social construction of sexuality in our history. The main insight for you to get from this is that that sexuality, or understandings of what sexuality mean, what sort of is understood to be sexually normal, natural, right, and good, is all dependent on the historical and cultural context in which you are located at the moment, right? So we see sexuality constructed differently in different cultures at the same point in time, and we see sexuality constructed differently in a single culture at different points in history. Really important to make sure that when you're talking about a particular concept, a particular understanding of sexuality, they don't impose it on a different cultural context or a different historical period, because it wouldn't make sense in that context. Okay, so our understanding of ourselves as sexual beings, as other people, and also of the sexual hierarchy of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, are all products of the historical processes of social construction. You got to have that down. I'm pretty sure you do. The next big idea is the concept of social institution, right? I want you to see sexuality as a social institution. And when I say this, I don't want you to see sexuality as only a social institution. That is, I want you to use the conceptual tool of the concept social institution to understand sexuality as a way to see it sociologically, right? So I give you that sexuality is a social institution to the extent that it is a system of rules that organizes the social world. Obviously, there are other things about sexuality that exist and are real, but this is a lens that is going to help you see sexuality sociologically, right? And you are absolutely capable of doing this. I've already seen you do this. You've identified, for example, social structures of sexuality. When you made your sexual hierarchies, this is a pattern of cultural values that created a system of rules that organizes the social world, for which people who organize their sexuality at the top of the hierarchy can expect rewards, celebration, cultural valuation, and the people whose sexuality is organized at the bottom of the sexual hierarchy can expect negative consequences, judgments, and in some cases crimes and incarceration. You also have already identified sexual norms, right? And especially as we look at how sexual norms, which I'll just refresh your memory, we sociologists say norms because we are talking about rules, but we want you to understand that rules are both formal and informal. So all the rules about sex and sexuality, you know what they are. You are subject to them, and you probably enforce them on other people through your judgments of them, through the way that you laugh at some of the kinds of things that you hear from your friends and colleagues, the way that you give somebody a pat on the back for some kinds of sexual expressions and might judge them for others. We all enforce norms, and we all are subject to the enforcement of norms. This is the big idea. Sexuality as a social institution exists outside the individual, right? So although all of your personal precious sense of self and the way that you have your own sexual desires and your own sexual morality and the way that you understand what's right and wrong and good and bad about sexuality is one thing, but the sort of system of rules that you as an individual have to interact with those are two different things, right? The sexuality, when you see sexuality as a social institution, you can understand how the individual has to engage with the social world to express their sexuality, to both communicating and then to actually have sex, and that these are two important aspects of sexuality that are useful to keep in mind. And you can do this through the theoretical concept of the social institution. It's not the only theoretical concept that's useful, but in terms of sociology, I think I'm going to make the pitch that it's the most important one, and I'm certainly going to make the pitch for this class that it's the one that you need to learn deeply and have a deep understanding of. The third and perhaps most challenging idea that was the big idea of this class is the way that sexuality is both a product of and contributes to social inequalities, right? And so this is the one that we spent quite a bit of time over several different topics to sort of bring this idea out in different contexts and in different ways. Hopefully by the end of the class you can put all those pieces of the puzzle together to understand that that inequality and sexuality intersect in two directions, right? The first is that the way that the social world organizes sexuality produces inequalities, that sexuality is a vector of inequality. Right? And so this is the simpler idea, right? The idea that not all sexual identities and practices are valued in the same way. That some people's sexuality is given greater value, higher status, etc., and other kinds of sexual identities are devalued, produces, as you now know, a sexual hierarchy. Excuse me. and that sexual hierarchy is one tool to understand this kind of vector of inequality that, like, for example, people, like the concept of, for example, heteronormativity argues that this culture values heterosexuality to a greater extent than it values lesbian sexuality, gay sexuality, bisexuality. It's a pretty simple concept, and we've seen a lot of social change lately that has closed the gap between those, but we don't see evidence of inequality across those sexual identities yet. Right, but that we also, it's more complicated than that, right? That keep in mind that that's kind of the simple way to understand it, and I do still think it's valuable to think about this in terms of both simple and complex ways, but that we need to bring an intersectional perspective to this understanding of kind of good and bad and right and wrong, and understanding that it's not just about straights being celebrated and LGBTQ people being less celebrated. It's also about how the social organization on other dimensions, right, of race, class, gender, age, ability, etc., also put you into different places on the sexual hierarchy, right? And so while it is, you may get a certain amount of social value for like organizing your sexuality through marrying your sexual partner, that the kind of value that you get through this isn't equal across all racial categories, all people of all ages, and people of all classes. Okay, so that's one way that sexuality is socially organized unequally. The next part of this big idea is the way that sexuality itself has operated as a social force that reproduces inequalities. And in particular, we focused in this class on race, class, and gender. So we've experienced several examples of places where powerful classes of people use sexuality as a tool for reinforcing inequalities, right? And so, for example, one of the things that I'd like you to draw on in understanding this is the example of colonial surveillance of Indigenous peoples of Canada, right? And so we looked at how colonizers, as a powerful class of people, pulled out the sexuality of Indigenous groups for ridicule, for condemnation, for surveillance, and for control as a tool that put social distance between the colonizers and the colonized, right? As a tool that reinforced a racialized hierarchy between whites who were obviously good and moral and right because their sexualities were organized according to their social value system, consistent with their church, etc., and pulled out the sexualities to racialize as a social process, to mark as different, to mark as less fully human, right? They use sexuality to racialize Indigenous people as a group. One of the things that's useful to make this visible to us is to understand that these social patterns have operated the same way in different historical contexts. So the same way that colonizers enacted their sexuality upon Indigenous people to racialize them is the same social process that in what became the United States of America, the enslaving whites marked and racialized African American enslaved populations and reestablishing their right to dominate that group, reestablishing the lack of humanity of black people by pointing to differences of sexuality. Right? I might point out in that example that, of course, the system of slavery in the United States came with a lot of sexual violence against enslaved people, especially enslaved women, by whites. And what we can see in terms of how sexuality operates as a social force that supports and reproduces and really reinforces inequality is that it doesn't matter if the white landowners were breaking their own sexual norms to have sex outside of marriage and without the consent of their slaves, quote unquote, their slaves. It doesn't matter that they broke their own sexual norms to enact sexual violence on a powerless group. The sexuality of power people is always defined as good and moral and right. The power itself to define what is good and moral and right is what is at the core here. And then the racial categories, the sexual differences, the class categories, and I would argue the gender categories are produced out of that power dynamic. And that sexuality is a key force that has been used to support and reproduce inequalities in the past, and that it is still a social force that supports and reproduces inequalities today. I think that there's a lot of evidence that that I've presented in this class across different kinds of topics to make that case. It's not important to me that you are convinced that I'm correct in that, but I want you to understand what the case is, and I want you to understand what evidence you might marshal to make this understanding visible to you from the course materials, and think through the ways that social forces, that sexuality hasn't been neutral in the historical domination of powerful groups over less powerful groups, that in fact it's been an active social force that's been operating over time. Okay, those are the three big ideas of the class. I want you to walk away from this class with those in mind, even if some of the smaller details slip away from you. But you might need those smaller details for another week or so, because of course you have one big final exam coming up. I'm going to give you a little bit of info on the final exam. I'm hoping that the final exam will be comfortable for you, that you'll know what to expect, because of course you've taken not only the quizzes but the midterm exam, and the final exam is going to be very similar to the midterm. The exam format is exactly the same as the midterm, except that it has a few more questions. Right, so the first 50 questions will be worth 1 point each, and they are multiple choice, the same kind of thing, 4 choices per question. The next 25 questions are worth 2 points each. They are the similar kinds of fill-in-the-blank questions. And so, you'll need to understand key concepts. You'll need to understand the reading material in the textbook, in the linked material, in the modules. This is a comprehensive exam covering the entire semester. But it is a tilted comprehensive. So that is 60 to 70% of the material will be from the second half of the class since the midterm. And you'll have about a third, I would say, from the first half of the class before the midterm. As in the midterm, if your question is it on the test? The answer is yes. All the textbook, all the linked readings, all of the modules, everything is eligible for being on the exam. Finally, I want to thank you for taking this course. This online course has been, we don't get to talk to each other very often, but I still feel connected to my students, and I still feel like I wanted to give you my thanks for taking this course very seriously and dedicating the time and effort it takes to learning this material. I think it's really important, and it's the reason why I love my job. So thank you very much. Thanks for taking the course, and good luck on the exam.